That far-off divine event, what is that Tennyson described as that far-off divine event to which all creation moves. In mystical and occult philosophy, it is the return of all individual things to the divine source from which they originally came, an event which Hindu cosmology places at the end of a stupendous period of time called a Mahamanvantara, or a great manifestation of Brahman. For according to Hindu and theosophical teachings, universal activity is a succession of the days and nights of Brahman, the outbreathings and inbreathings of the one reality of life, whose name is derived from the Sanskrit briya, from which our own word breath is also descended. Yet in one of the sayings of the Buddha, the invisible path of birds through the sky is likened to the way of life of a sage, to the superbly self-effacing kind of man of whom a Chinese poem says, entering the forest, he does not disturb a blade of grass. Now, if these things are true, the ordinary man or woman has to accept them rather much on faith. And because it is difficult, if not impossible, for ordinary people to test their verity, and because the periods of time involved are past imagining it, will be asked whether such ideas are of the remotest practical value. For the events of which we are speaking are certainly divine and undoubtedly far off, and it may seem that the ancient Hindus were indulging in idle speculations for want of anything better to do. For us, the difficulty of this Hindu conception of the far-off divine event, when all things shall again become one with Brahman, is that taken at its face value, it makes the soul despair. For not only does so terrifying a period of time lie between now and the final resting of the universe in divine bliss, but the doctrine also goes on to say that eventually the universe will return again into a manifestation to another and another and another repetition of the whole process ad infinitum. It is important to remember, however, that the ancient teachers of these doctrines often described cosmological processes in terms of time simply for the sake of explanation, whereas they should actually be understood in terms of eternity. But there is actually the most intimate connection between these two apparently separate uses of the metaphor, the way the days and nights of Brahman are spread out in time in rather the same way as a ball of thread, an inch in diameter, is unrolled to the length of 100 yards. Its real state resembles a ball, but to be presented to the human mind, it has to be unrolled. For our idea of time is spatial. It has length, which is a spatial dimension. But eternity has no length. And the nearest thing to it in our experience is what we call the present moment. It cannot be measured, but it is always here. I am constantly amazed at the way in which thoughtful Westerners, Christians in particular, seem almost determined to miss the point of this connection. At this moment, the universe is both manifested as a collection of separate individual things, and at the same time, each of these things retains absolute unity and identity with its divine source. The object of Hindu, and for that matter of almost all Asian religion, is to awaken in man the realization of this unity and identity. In Hinduism, this realization is called moksha or kaivalya, and in Buddhism, nirvana. And it is astonishing how seldom the West achieves any real understanding of what this condition of the spirit involves. The old 19th century idea that nirvana meant simply oblivion is now generally discredited, but some of the conceptions that have taken its place are almost as fantastic. Certain allowances for this misunderstanding must be made, for just as in the West there are mature and immature conceptions of Christianity, so in the East there are mature and immature conceptions of Hinduism and Buddhism. In fact, even some of the canonical scriptures of the East are just as overlaid with the interpolated comments of scribes as the Bible, even more so in the Buddhist scriptures. So far as words, thoughts, ideas, and images are concerned, The doctrines of Buddhism and most forms of Hinduism are so negative and hopeless that they seem to be a sort of glorying in nihilism by a state of infinite consciousness into which the individual becomes absorbed, even though his physical body may continue to live on. If he ever returns out of this trance condition, it remains always in the back of his mind. The things around him seem like the insubstantial shadows of a dream for life, like a dome of many-colored glass stains, the white radiance of eternity, till death tramples it to fragments. But one of the principal mistakes of Western interpretations of Asian thought is to equate Brahman with the infinite and the realization of one's identity with Brahman as a change from finite to infinite consciousness. Perhaps I can put this in a more intelligible fashion. These doctrines first emphasize the somewhat grimly obvious fact that man has no abiding future. Without exception, everything that we attain or create, even the memorials that survive our death, must perish without trace, because furthermore, happiness exists only in relation to misery, pleasure. In relation to pain, the perceptive man does not try to separate them. The relation is so inseparable that in some sense happiness is misery. This also is a cardinal principle of Mahayana Buddhism, from which it is clear that neither in Hinduism or Buddhism can it be said that the highest spiritual attainment is to become merged into any kind of infinitude. I can perhaps understand verbally and intellectually that in desiring pleasure I am trying to quench my thirst with salt water, since the more I get pleasure, the more I must want it. To want pleasure is to lack it. But still I seem unable to be rid of the emotional habit of desiring it. And Buddhism has the quality of oneness as distinct from manyness. And that realization is the knowledge that the forms and objects of the universe are in fact one, even though they appear to be many. If then I see that the desire for pleasure burns me by its implication of pain, I begin to desire not to desire nirvana, to seek to give up body is one without a second. In this, however, I have simply converted nirvana into another name for pleasure. For pleasure is by definition the object of desire. It is what we please, which is to say, what we desire of one thing. But it was precisely in relation to such notions and ideals that Lao Tzu said, "Get rid of knowledge, eject wisdom, and the people will be benefited 100-fold." Nirvana, he was talking about supposed knowledge of what the ideal way of life is. As I said at the beginning, there is simply no way of knowing what the Tao is. But nirvana is equated with shunyata, the nothing beyond nothing, to suggest that it is simply impossible to see Brahman. We have just to look with our eyes, for Brahman is nothing other than what we are beholding at this moment. So what, you ask? At the moment I am beholding a book. Is that anything to get excited about? Should I feel uplifted and spiritually enlightened just because this book is Brahman? I don't see anything divine and mighty about this collection of paper and printer's ink. To seek for God, to desire God, is merely to drag him down into the level of futile aims. We are accustomed to believe that a sage or mystic is one who beholds God or Brahman in all things. But if Brahman is all things, surely an ordinary man in seeing them is doing no less than the sage. Now, from the standpoint of Western culture, whether ancient or modern, Christian or secular, capitalist or communist, the reason is that because there is nothing apart from Brahman, Brahman cannot be seen in quite the ordinary way. To see things, we must be able to distinguish them, which means that we must be able to separate them from other things or from ourselves. But with Brahman, this cannot be done for. When you look at this book, Brahman is looking at Brahman. It is working purposefully, as it must, but to no purpose. It is looking for results in terms of itself. It wants to get results from the... Thus, anyone who talks a lot about philosophy and psychology is supposed to be the man who knows the way, but there is no way. Nobody knows the way. The only way that there is the path of a bird through the sky. Now you see it, though. Now you don't. Not a train. Life is not going anywhere. There is nothing to be attained. All striving and grasping is so much smoke in the clutch of a dissolving hand. But for the sage, the knowledge of his identity with Brahman is of immense practical importance. He knows it as well, and as fully as he knows that he is alive. But this certainly does not mean that in place of himself, other people, houses, stars, hills, and trees, he sees a formless, all-pervasive and infinite luminosity, which seems to be some people's idea of the divine reality. Is it possible, just for a moment, to realize this without jumping to conclusions? Is it too impossible to admit that all our well-laid traps for happiness are just so many ways of kidding ourselves that by meditation, psychoanalysis, Dianetics, Raja Yoga, it should rather be said that he feels Brahman, the force of the universe, at work in everything he does, thinks and feels, and this gives a powerful and liberating impulse to his spirit. What happens now? You find yourself in what is perhaps a rather unfamiliar state of mind, just watching, not trying to get anything, not expecting. He is terrified of being genuine, of accepting himself as he is, and tries to deceive himself into the belief that he is as he wishes to be. Yet there is no harm in just one more word, one more word about what lies on the other side of despair, provided we all trusting neither circumstances nor themselves, which together make up life. They are forever interfering and trying to make their own souls and the world conform with preconceived patterns.
Yep.
This interference is simply the attempt of the ego to dominate life. We are all familiar with the many involuntary acts of the human body, which never happen so long as we are trying to make them happen, so long as we are anxious about them. Going to sleep, remembering a forgotten name, or under certain circumstances. Well, there is something like this which happens upon the soul condition, that we are not trying to make it happen, that we have realized quite clearly. In Zen it is called Satori Silan awakening. Perhaps we can see now the reason for the double meaning in the metaphor of the bird's path in the sky of lived life. Just as the bird leaves no trace, no record of its flight upon the void, so human desire can gain nothing out of life, and life will have disappeared. If the truth be known, there never was any distinction save in our imaginations. This is called union with Brahman. For he that loseth his life shall find it